Are you ready?
Yeah, anytime.
Okay, everybody, we're gonna start this. Can everybody hear me? We're without the use of the microphone.
Yes.
Two or three of us can't figure it out. Are you okay? Yeah, okay. So my name is Herb Reckinger. I live in Cottage Grove. I grew up in South St. Paul. Don't hold that against me. And we're gonna talk a little bit about a Canadian fur trade company. It's not the Hudson Bay Company. We'll talk a little bit about them, but it's the Northwest Company, and it preceded the American Fur Company. And they had a great history that lasted only about 40 years. Okay, and when you think about it, there's a lot of things as Minnesotans that you're going to appreciate if you don't know it already when this talk is over. So their contributions were great in Canada and Minnesota and a lot of areas here on this map here that Emily provided. Probably from here and north, you know, Missouri River, the river's out here. Over here, you'll be able to see some of the routes they did. I have Lewis and Clark's here, but the Canadians beat them to it, as you'll see. And a couple different passes over the mountains where they actually traded. So they were a Montreal-based company, and they had a yen for exploring, unlike the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company started in the 1650s by Radisson and Rosier, two French guys that couldn't get a charter for Hudson Bay from the French. So they went to the British, and the British granted them that parcel. So Hudson Bay Company sat on the bay for over 100 years, didn't have to do a thing. Native Americans would bring them down their furs, they trade with them. They shipped their furs back to England, and everything was fine. It was like York Factory and Churchill Factory were the two ports. Here's the Nelson River out of Lake Winnipeg. That was where one of the great depots for them was. So, and that was fine. And the rest of Canada here was ruled, Eastern Canada was ruled by the French. Western Canada, that was anybody's land. Nobody owned that. I mean, it might have been owned by the French, but nobody had been there yet. So this whole business I'm talking about was driven by a fashion in beaver fur hats. Okay, so I have a beaver skin here. I have some of these crazy looking hats here. Okay, those are all made from beaver fur. And it's not what you see here. These are the guard hairs that keep a beaver kind of waterproof and stuff. If you go counter current, you can see felt in here. They had combs that could take this off. And that felt was actually taken off the leather of the beaver, off the skin. And then they had a way to adhere it to all these different hats. It was a status symbol, you know, and the fancier the hat was, the more it cost. So if you could walk around with an expensive hat, everybody thought you were well off. This is over here. Why did they come here to North America to do this? Because beaver were almost extinct in Europe. Okay. So just keep in mind they're sitting on the bay. So in the 1730s, two Frenchmen came out west. And one of them was Etienne Brule. The only thing he did wrong was he never recorded it. So nobody knows where he was. Nobody knows how far he got in. But L'Abbé Rondre, in 1731, he came from Grand Portage through the lakes. And he did get out west, and he did record it. And I have his writings, and it's in a book like this by Greenwood Press. So he was one of the early French. But then something happened in 1759 that changed all of that. Montcalm and Wolfe battled on the plains of Abraham, and Montcalm was defeated by Wolfe. So the Brits, they kicked French rule out of Canada. Okay, so their hierarchy, they went to Canada. You know, the French people stayed. And the people that piloted these canoes, they were called voyageurs. And they were stocky little guys, about 5'6" maybe on the average. And the reason that they fit the bill so well like this is they had a lower center of gravity. They could fit in the canoes. Okay. So into the 1760s, Montreal started having these little bitty fur companies that get together. And all they were doing was fighting each other. They'd fight each other on portages and stuff. Something had to happen. So in the in the 1770s, they formed one company. They called themselves the Northwest Fur Company. Here's their logo is on this glass here. And they started going into the West and learning how to get into the West. And sometimes it'd be decades before they got there. They were already making beaver extinct. And the Indians that they traded with were they were fighting with other tribes way before we got there. Okay, and they were pushing the tribes west, like the Sioux. They were much farther in Minnesota. They were in northern and northeastern Minnesota. When Robert Andre's brother was killed on Lake of the Woods, that was the Sioux that killed. Okay, so a lot of things were going on with these guys. They were given things that could make life easier for Native Americans. It wasn't all good, I'll tell you that right now. It was, we brought our diseases over, scarlet fever. We brought our alcohol over too, but not all these Northwest Company guys dealt in alcohol. We'll get to one of them later. Okay, so let's talk about how they got across the country. So coming from Montreal, they didn't go through the Great Lakes like you might imagine. Out of Montreal, they went up the Ottawa River and down the Mattawa River into Georgian Bay. Okay, and Georgian Bay is on Lake Huron. When you're in school, they tell you that this looks like a Voyager carrying a pack. Okay, so anyway, then they could easily, all they had was one portage here at Sioux Rapids, and then to Grand Portage. They could do this in 36 to 40-foot canoes. Okay, and there's a picture of one right there. That portrait was drawn by Frances Ann Hopkins, and she liked to put herself into those paintings too. This was 1770s, and that's her and her husband in the middle of it. And she's done a number of those of these paintings. This is one called In the Rapids, and it is dated 1879. So it was much later after the Northwest Company went out of business. But that's what those big canoes looked like. I got some numbers for you. They were called the Montreal canoes. They were 36 to 40 feet long. They would carry roughly 14, would take 14 people roughly to get them across the water, and they could carry 10,000 pounds, 5 tons. Okay, I should have stood these up. Anyway, this is the other replica. This is a replica of the 24-foot canoes, and those are the canoes that went from Grand Portage into the country. You had smaller lakes, you had smaller rivers, creeks, narrow portages and stuff. They needed to make a smaller canoe.
Herb, could you hold that up for a second just so
sure.
they can all see it?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple more paddles here. I got about 5 in here when my kids were little broken. There you go. And here's a tall paddle. Where were they used? I think if you look here, this guy has one of them in the front, and the guy in the back has one. So you use them in the back for steering, but the guy in front used it when they got into rapids. And they weren't afraid of rapids. Almost every portage they used on our border with Minnesota, they went in the 1960s. And there's a book called Voices from the Rapids, and they got all kinds of stuff on there. Muskets without the wood, nested kettles, all kinds of stuff, axes, everything. Okay, so who invented the birch bark canoe? Did them guys in England invent it? Did the French? Native American. Most of them guys, they had 12 or 14-foot canoes, but they're the ones that taught these guys how to make a canoe. What were these canoes made of? Birch bark. When you peel it off a tree, it naturally folds this way. I didn't fold this up. It folded itself. So it made it good because that's what's exposed on the outside of a birch bark canoe. Cedar to about this size. This is just a piece of paneling I had left over. But that's about how wide these pieces were. And how did they make this? They pounded stakes in the ground. Okay, put the fabric in there. They sewed it together with pine sap. Okay, and they would put charcoal in it and get it really hot, melt it, put charcoal in it to make it bond better. And that's what they sealed the leaks with. And the other thing they used was a root of the black spruce, called Watap. Okay, and if you stand at the base of a black swamp spruce, you can pull up a root, not as big around as a pencil, but almost that big. And they would boil that, and for 30 feet, it would be the same diameter before it started to narrow. No little roots came off of it. It just kept growing out like that. Okay, and then this is all done hundreds of years before Europeans ever got it. Okay, and they could take that and split it. So when you see the sewing, you see it all along here. You know, just a few roots, they could do a lot with that. So as they traveled, they had to carry they had to carry these ingredients. What do these ingredients for a canoe all have in common with each other? They were all found in the woods. Okay, part of the granite shield. Granite shield ran about this big. The bedrock is all granite, and the only things that grow there are spruces, birch, and aspens, pines. You know. So, am I still loud enough? Yeah. Okay. So another thing that the Indians imparted to Native Americans was their food. Okay, these guys that came across in these big canoes, they called them the porkies. They could eat good. They could bring all kinds of meat from Montreal and stuff. These guys couldn't do that, transport it that far. So what they ate was, you think of as beef jerky, only it was called pemmican. I'll tell you how the Native Americans made it and sold it to them. Okay. So they took this, they took buffalo meat, they boiled the fat off of it, then they hung the meat and dried it off. They kept the fat. And when they were done, when that all dried up good, they'd mix it back together again and sew it into buffalo skin meat. Big chunks like that. And when they ate, there was animal hair, human hair, dirt, sticks, everything. How would you like to eat that? But it gave them the high protein, the stuff they needed. And they'd eat it in the morning if they couldn't collect any game. You know, they'd be out 18 hours on the water usually, or more. Okay, they'd have to fix their canoes if it drew leaks. Okay, and then one more thing I mentioned, put it in buffalo bags. Everything, every pack of everything weighed 90 pounds. That was to give everything a uniform weight. These guys had to carry not one pack, a minimum of two packs. Okay, so they were basically carrying their weight. And these aren't portages like this. I've hiked the Grand Portage twice. It's 9 miles long. It doesn't go like this and gain 600 feet. It goes like this and gains 600 feet. There's a nice boardwalk over a swamp a mile before you get there. They waded through that with all that stuff. And a lot of them guys, if they got hernias and stuff, they were like, so wish I had a little kid to do this. But anyway, did they carry their packs like this, do you think? Huh? Did they carry them like this? No. They carried them. Here with what's called a tump. That's a feather. So you can see where they get hernias, break their necks, all kinds of stuff. Like this. And you didn't walk like this because you had 2 packs. You had to walk like this. That's why Lake Huron looks like a boat. Okay. And not an easy place. There was a black voyager named Pierre Banga, and he could carry 5 of them. Multiply that times 450 pounds. 2-3 times as well. So they liked long stretches of water, but you didn't have it in Minnesota. You didn't have it through most of that. Okay. I told you about the terrain here, you know, and it's very delicate. How many of you have been to the Boundary Waters? How many have taken a border portage? Wonderful. You're going to like the last part of this talk. Anyway, the average depth of bedrock in the Boundary Waters, and most of that granite shield, is 10 inches. It takes 1,000 years to make an inch of soil up there on the average. And that was all laid bare, that granite by the glaciers. Okay, so that's why it's so delicate up there. The soil, you don't find soil deeper than that, but you'll find it a lot shallower than 10 inches. Okay, so every July, they met, these two groups of canoeists, okay, working for the same company. And they were, most of the leaders, the clerks, the guys that man the brigades of canoes, they were Scotsmen, names like McGillivray, McTavish, Frobisher, you know, they were Scotsmen, Mackenzie. Okay, but here's what happened. Every year, these guys would come and they would winter in little stockaded forts, okay, and trade with the Indians, do some trapping themselves, you know, but mostly they left it to the Native Americans, they trade stuff to them. And they would do this all winter. And then they would, as soon as the ice broke out here, then they would race for Grand Portage. And these guys have had the easy time meeting them here. So all these bosses of this company, this corporation, they spent a month inside the walls of Grand Portage. Voyagers never got to go in. They never got to go inside. Grand Portage is a nice restored fort today, but they never got to go in. And at the end of that 3-4 weeks, they'd have to race back because those seasons are short when you get up there. I traced you some of the routes that they used. And here's some of them go, wow, it looks like they crossed the Rockies. They did. And those brigades could no way make it back in one season. They would take 2 seasons to get back. And they had a fort set at Fort Francis. That's why Fort Francis International, Canadian side of International Falls. That's why it's called Fort Francis. They'd meet there, then that little group would go through what today is Voyageurs National Park and the boundary waters to get down there in time. Some guys would have to go back. Everything had to be killed. Okay, so Grand Portage is a 9-mile long portage, and it bypasses like the last 20 miles of our border with Canada. And it contains our biggest dropping river waterfall. Forget the name of it, but it's on the Pigeon River, High Falls, I guess it's called. And they put in a state park 20-some years ago, Grand Portage State Park. So you can drive there, and anybody, it's accessible for anybody to go to a viewpoint and see it. And I've been to it on both sides, Canada and back in the day. So it bypasses some really treacherous rapids on that Pigeon River. Okay, so what do you think happened when they started getting out here? The Native Americans, what do you think they did? You think they went all the way to Hudson Bay on the Nelson River? No, they started trading with the Northwest Company. Okay. So these guys, Hudson Bay Company, they had to go into the country. They didn't like it one bit. So these two companies fought each other for 40 years. Okay, and you get to where some of these rivers meet, like Saskatchewan, or another river meet it. Sometimes on one side of the river, oh, there's a Hudson Bay Company. Oh, Northwest Company on this side of the river. So they almost drove each other to bankruptcy. So in 1803, the Montrealers thought Grand Portage is on American soil. These Americans are going to get out here one of these days. Get out this far west, you know. They were there way ahead. And so they moved up to Fort William. Has anybody heard of Fort William? You know where it is? Today it's called Thunder Bay. It used to be Port Arthur, Fort William. And that fort fronted the, where did I put it? Oh, that is. Okay, that's a restoration of Fort William. Okay, and it's a true restoration. They say if you could resurrect a Voyager or one of them clerks and parachute him in there, he'd think he was back home. But this is on the Kaministiguia River, which is a river they ascended, and it still came back into the boundary waters. Here, I got it right here, that route there. But anyway, they wanted to restore the fort. Well, today, and for the last, I don't know how many years, 50, 60, 70 years, that's been a Canadian Pacific Rail here. So they conducted their digging, sometimes overnight, sometimes digging underneath and having to restore that in the morning. But they had, a lot of the digging was done. But it's just a superb fort. The Grand Portage fort wasn't as big, and they don't have quite as many of the buildings restored. But in both cases, they knew they can use that X-ray stuff, even though the post is turned to dirt of stockade post, they can tell exactly what it is. And at the opposite end of Grand Portage was a small fort called Fort Charlotte. There was just a couple buildings there before they shoved off and went up to the Pigeon River. So this competition went on until they almost drove each other bankrupt. About 1814, Lord Selkirk, anybody heard of him? He started the area around Winnipeg. Selkirk settlement, they call it. Well, that kind of spelled the end of the fur trade, because these guys would start trading around what is today Winnipeg, and that brought on the ox carts. You ever heard of the ox cart history in St. Paul?
Oh, yes.
Those guys were intercepting that, bringing that up. And they had a big shootout in 1814 with 7 acres. I forget the name. It was a 7 acre. And it was doomed. They put a few Northwest Company clerks to jail and stuff. They caught them and stuff. They knew they were doomed. So in 1821, the Hudson Bay Company got together with the Northwest Company and they merged. Okay. And they call it the Hudson Bay Company today because it had been around 100 years longer, but they had equal shares. It was equal shares. They were just as big as they were. But if they'd have stayed together, if they had stayed apart, they'd have continued to fight. You know, would have, bad things would happen. So you had great explorers within this group of guys. I said some of them M guys, you know, McTavish, Mackenzie. Okay, they wanted to be great explorers. Okay, and what were they looking for? A land northwest passage. There was no, when you look back on it now, there is no good one. But Alexander Mackenzie was the first one to try it with the Northwest group. So in 1789, he came out of Grand Portage here. He went, there's a river they named after him, the Mackenzie River. Anyway, he was told by another Minnesota fur trader, Peter Pond, that there's a path through the mountains. And you think there can't be any paths through the mountains. Well, how about the Columbia Gorge? See, that's a great example. That goes right through the Cascade. And so he was looking for that. And he went here. He got up to Great Slave Lake. Oh, this river goes mostly west. We got to the mouth, the river turned north. And they knew it was going to go to the Arctic. But for the sake of him identifying that, he went all the way north. He didn't go to the mouth. He went until they got to Tidewater. You know what I mean? Where the tide comes up. Okay, we're close enough. It ends. So then he came back. He went all the way back into Minnesota. There, came out, went to England, studied maps a little bit longer, and astronomy and different things. Came back, and in 1791 and 2, he tried it again, and he came across. He went up the Peace River here and crossed here. And when he got to the Fraser River, the Blackfeet, I forget which tribe they took it. We've never been down that river, you'll get killed. So Mackenzie avoided. And the only bad part of his Northwest Passage, last 200 miles were on foot. And he hit the Pacific here at Bella Coola. Okay. We did an Alaskan tour one time. Can you guys tell me when we go past Bella Coola? Never heard of it. Figure it out yourself. So I told you they were mostly Scots. So when he did this, you know, if we have an event happen now, a book can be out a week or two later. Well, not so with what he did. Here's his writings of those 2 expeditions. They're still in print in different forms. But there was 2 guys waiting for that book to come out, his journals. They were Americans. One was Thomas Jefferson. One was Meriwether Lewis. When Mackenzie crossed North America, first European guy, first, you know, Native Americans didn't know how to cross the country. That was the third thing they imparted to the fur traders, was they didn't know how to cross the country. But going west, they knew how to tell them where the portage was. It's a big lake, you know, they knew how to tell them how to keep going. So besides the pemmican, how to make a canoe, they showed them how to go west. Okay. So it was those guys waiting for this journal. Now they knew they weren't gonna. Meriwether Lewis was a teenager when Mackenzie did this. This is 15 years, almost 15 years earlier, when Mackenzie did this. But they were waiting to get this book and read. How did they do it? How did they cross the mountains? How did they the contact with the Native American tribes? You know, they weren't all, some were kind of hostile. These guys had to stay in the fur trade. Think of that. You're kind of at odds with nature and stuff. You're going down these skinny rivers, you're on these portages. You know, they had to get along with these guys, with the Native Americans. So anyway, that's a great thing that they imparted onto the Lewis and Clark expedition. They learned a lot from it. So then a few Americans joined the Hudson Bay, or joined the Northwest Company, and one was Simon Fraser, and the other one was Daniel Harmon. They're both from Bennington, Vermont. Okay, so they weren't all Canadians, they weren't all Brits, they weren't all Scots. And Simon Fraser descended the Fraser River that they named after him. Anybody ever seen the Hell's Gates Rapids? Ever heard of it? I've seen it. They got the steps there for the salmon and stuff going up. But he went down that Fraser River and he went up and he said, that's not the Northwest Passage. At Hell's Gate, they were on the cliffs. When they crossed mountains, they didn't carry their canoes over the Rocky Mountains. They bought horses from the Native Americans. They used horses to get their stuff over, built canoes on the other side. Okay, but then there was a Welshman. His name was David Thompson. And he was born in 1770. And when he was 14, he came to work for the Hudson Bay Company. At the age of 14, he'd already studied astronomy, maybe more than any guy that ever lived up to his time. He knew how to navigate by star and compass. You think he liked working for the Hudson Bay Company? No. So he defected in 1797. He came down from Hudson Bay to Mackinac Island. And in less than a year, he went to the Great Lakes here, went to Winnipeg. He wintered with where the Native Americans around Minot. The Mandan Indians, thank you. He wintered with them. And then when he came back into Minnesota, he was just east of the Red Lakes. And he heard about the Mississippi. And he incorrectly identified the Turtle River. Okay, because they were in the Turtle River. And here they see a stream that came in from the side of it that wasn't bigger. That Turtle River was putting in more water, which can happen on a small or large thing. But he was that close to being the discoverer in 1797 in Mississippi. So circle tour. So he is a guy. At one time he crossed the Rockies. And Saskatchewan River starts between Banff and Jasper Parks. Okay. That's called Athabasca Pass. The first time he crossed it, he came into a sizable river and it was flowing north. And they're looking for the Columbia. No, Columbia doesn't flow north. Well, it does there. It flows north for 100, 200 miles and it turns. Comes in. So he found it later, 1811 he found it. And that's what they used for those 10 years to get to Astoria, in Oregon and Washington. He was a great guy. He had a 40-year career in the Northwest. He married a mixed blood named Charlotte Small. Her dad was a fur trader, and mother was a Native American. They had 16 kids. He did not have a wife in both the wild and in Montreal, like a lot of them did. He's a devout Christian. There's 16 kids when his career was over. They all came out of the country with him. He got along with the Native Americans, refused to sell alcohol to them. And on one of his trips over the Rocky Mountains at Athabasca Pass, the Rocky Mountains, brought out some kegs of whiskey for him. Of course, they had their horses in. I'll take them over. They got to the top of the first hill, these big kegs of whiskey on these horses, and he just whipped the heck out of them. They ran to the bottom of the hill and accomplished what he wanted to do. All them crates got busted. He would have no problem. So from 1816 to 1824, he did work on our border. We had a really tough thing to debate with the Canadians when we started establishing the border. Here's a 49th barrel. He's the reason we got this in northern Minnesota. We wanted to do, the Canadians and Americans, they wanted to find a route to make the border. So they want, Canadians, of course, wanted to use the St. Louis River route. Okay. The St. Louis River comes in at the route, follow the St. Louis River, and then they would portage in the Lake Vermilion. This is used very little. We'd have lost half the Arrowhead. We'd have lost about half of the Mesabi Iron Range. We'd have lost the Superior National Forest, the Boundary Waters. So then we countered with that Fort Kaministaguya route up here. Thank God they came with the settlement of what the word is today. Our crooked border today. So that's not one river. Any other squiggly line in Minnesota is one river. Like the bulge out in western Minnesota, that's a Red River in the beginnings of Minnesota. We got the St. Croix on the east side. Up there, it's Pigeon River, Granite River, Basswood River, all these lakes and stud portages in between them. And also, that was a route that the voyagers most commonly used. That's what became our national border between our country. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1843. You have to look that up and read into that. So this boundary commission decided, we can't just say this is the border. How are we going to divide up the islands and stuff? So they decided to divide them up by acreage. Thompson had already done it in its travels. So that's why, anybody ever been on Lac La Croix? I canoed once with two of my kids and one of their friends. And I did this on purpose, but I could have a wild island on one side of me and an island with a cabin on it. That cabin island was Canada, and the other one island was Minnesota. You go right along the whole northern, it's a big lake, isn't it? She can attest. So he did all of it. And then they said, now when we get up to Lake of the Woods, here's what we want. We want you, Mr. Thompson, to find the most northwestern point on that lake. And from there, we'll go straight west till we hit the Mississippi. And then that line will come down to the 49th parallel. Have a problem with that? Mississippi doesn't get that far north. So he found that we don't have a good Minnesota map here. But anyway, up here, that's that point right here. Okay. And it's by Angle Inlet, I think is the name of it. And it's not the most northern part of Lake of the Woods. It's not the most it's not the most western part of the lake. It's the most northwestern part of it, which is what they want. Then it dropped down 49th parallel. So that's why we have Northwest Angle. That's why during COVID, the Canadians wouldn't let those people drive to their own place, which is kind of neat. So that's some of the great things they did for us. Now, Emily made some copies of booklets that I have, and I'll just talk about a few of these for a little bit. This is Grand Portage by Walter O'Meara, and that's about Daniel Harmon. And he was a lot like Thompson, refused to sell alcohol at one way. Came out of the country when it was over with his family. Okay, and O'Meara wrote this about the time I was born. Okay, so it's an old one. And it's historical fiction. And I read this in Harmon's journal many years ago. And do you know Stairway Portage? It goes from Duncan into Rose. It's not a border portage, is it? That's what he said in this book. That's the first of two errors he had. Then for the sake of talking about Grand Portage, he had Harmon come down in like 1804 or 5. And it was just to tell how the transition was going from Grand Portage up to Fort William. And he never did that. He was one of these guys that was on the other side of the Rockies, most of his career. Okay. And then O'Meara wrote this one too. It's called The Last Portage. It's about John Tanner. He was a 7 or 8 year old in Ohio. Native Americans kidnapped him, brought him up to Mackinac. He was sold to an Indian gal. And he lived 30 years right about at the Minnesota, North Dakota, Canada border. He came back out after 30 years and realized he wasn't quite a European anymore. He wasn't quite a Minnesotan anymore. And he was the last guy that was seen with Henry Rose Schoolcraft's brother at Mackinac. They found him dead, and I think Tanner killed him because they never saw Tanner after that. Kind of a tragic story. Here's Simon Fraser's journal, Mackenzie's I talked about. If you want a good book, this is still kept in print. It's by the great Minnesota Historical Society lady, Grace Lee Newt. Okay, and she's written a lot of books. She's written my favorite book about Lake Superior. She wrote it in 1944. Still the best thing you can read about the whole history of Lake Superior up to that point. And then I'll end with John Bigsby. Here's Thompson's narrative. So you got journals and narratives. This is a journal. This is a narrative. This was written as it happened by Mackenzie. This was written after it was all over. That's what a narrative is. You're telling the story. Sigurd Olson, kind of an inspiration into me, looking into these guys. One of my friends borrowed me this book to read, and he keeps talking. He was an interesting guy, of course. He died in the 80s. He was an environmentalist, lived in Italy. And he went on this fantastic canoe ride with these guys on the back. He wrote a number of books. These guys that he's talking about, these fur traders, are more interesting than him. So there's a Van Murray guy, Howard Cybers, and he grew up on Isle Royal. And he's written a number of books. You can still find this. And each, there's Grand Portage right there. Okay. And any of his books, you got a nice portrait that he drew, and then he tells a little page-filled biography. And it's all about making canoes and all that stuff. Thompson has a ton of books about him, not enough by American authors. You know, these guys played such a big part in our history. You know, they used to teach Minnesota history in schools in Minnesota. I don't know if they do anymore. But if you can find this dinosaur copy of National Geographic, May of 1996, it has a great article about David Thompson in here. It's kind of long. You know, it's an easy way if you can find that copy. And then I'll finish and I'll read this and I'll open it up for questions. This is Dr. John Bigsby's book that he wrote, and he was on the Boundary Commission with David Thompson, and this group of guys that went up and divvied up these islands and stuff. And there's about 40, 50 pages, and it's just volume 1 and volume 2. You could use that today because those portages haven't changed. Those boundary portages, they haven't changed. You could use that and go on a canoe trip and just do what he says, tells you how long the portages are. But here's his first impression of David Thompson. I was well placed at a table, and a singular looking person of about 50. He was plainly dressed, quiet, and observant. His figure was short and compact, and his black hair was worn long all around and cut square, as if by one stroke of the shears, just above the eyebrows. His complexion was of the gardener's ruddy brown, while the expression of his deeply furrowed features was friendly and intelligent. But his cut short nose gave him an odd look. His speech betrayed the Welshman in him, although he left his native hills when very young, age 14. I might have been spared this description of Mr. David Thompson by saying he greatly resembled Curran, the Irish orator. He was an astronomer first to the Hudson Bay Company and then to the Boundary Commission. I afterwards traveled much with him and have now only to speak of him with great respect, or I ought to say with admiration. No living person possesses a tithe of his information respecting the Hudson Bay countries, which from 1793 to 1820, he was constantly traversing. Never mind his Bunyan-like face and his cropped hair. He has a very powerful mind and a singular faculty of picture making. He can create a wilderness and people it with warring savages, or climb the Rocky Mountains with you in a snowstorm, so clearly and palpably that you can only shut your eyes and hear the crack of the rifle or feel the snowflakes melt on your cheeks as he talks. Mm-hmm. By the end of Thompson's career, he had mapped the rivers, streams, and mountains of a third of North America. Yeah, and I bought this up at Fort William some years ago. But you can see Lake Superior. You can see Lake of the Woods here and stuff. But this was so detailed that this is in the 18, he did it 1810 to the 1820s. That bush pilots were using his maps over 100 years later. That's how great he is. So I think I've showed you about everything. Does anybody have any questions? We still got some time. Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that there could be usually 14 people on these canoes.
And these here, and not the ones in, these were about 8 at the most here, in the 24-foot. But these here, let's see what they have. Yeah, about 1920. But remember, she's romanticizing this. She did not live in that era.
My question is, what was the goal of all these people that would go in the canoes? I mean,
To
they
get the
would've-
furs back to England.
what were they all extracting? Or did some of them, like, was one person cook or?
It was all divided up. These were the mules. And it's a voyager's hike. It's lakes, streams, portages. Messy portage way up in Canada is like 11 miles long. I can't imagine it. Crossing watersheds. We crossed a watershed in Minnesota on the border, and it's called North and South Lake. North Lake starts the Granite River, and that goes up into Lake Sagamon. And you know all this, don't you? Well experienced.
And what about the one that?
Go. Yeah, I forgot to talk about it. Thank you. Okay, Grace Lee Newt, a much admired historian at the Historical Society. That used to be called, if you remember, Thomas Connor's Fur Post. Only this Douglas Burke. They had doubts. She was still alive. He went to Montreal and did some research. Connor was illiterate. He couldn't have written those journals. And it was John Sayre. And he was, I read an article about him. All he was about that whole thing was apologetic. You know, he felt bad by what he proved. But anyway, they renamed it Northwest. They didn't want to name it John Sayre. They just called it Northwest Company. So Sayre occupied another fort that he got to via the St. Croix. Anybody been between Danbury and starts with Danbury? What's the other town south of it? On the Yellow River.
On the yellow, not Grantsburg.
It's on the Yellow River. The fort is. It's called Fort Follivant. That was another fort that Sayre occupied for a season or two. When the second season, last season, when they left, Native Americans burned it down. They could see it as they left. And in that fort, I was there when they were digging the thing up before they restored it. They found the biggest cache of wild rice, and they figured it was hanging up in the ceiling somewhere when the crack came crashing down. It was preserved. I got a hunk of charcoal. So there's a guy named Dennis Hoffa at the Pine City Post. He was a historian. He'd go there and he'd be dressed up like a little jerk. And I started talking to him one time, and I asked him something, and he says, "Well, what are you talking about? This is 1808 or what?" "Oh, okay, yeah, I'm talking." And I told him I had a copy of the Shoe and Canoe, and he'd come right out and say, "How'd you get that?" So good stuff. So anyway, any more questions?
How much did those canoes weigh?
The canoes weighed, I don't know what they weighed empty, but you know, every day you travel, they get heavier with water absorbing into them almost every day. At night, they'd have to get the pitch going and put in patches. So, you know, they were fragile. That all that cedar that you see in here, that runs here, that all distributes that weight out. These are braces. These are seats all the way from front to back.
So when they portage, did they take everything out and portage separately?
Thank you.
Leave it all in?
No, no, no. If you picked it up, the bottom would fall. That canoe never touched the ground until evening. Never touched the ground. They unloaded it, they jumped in the water and unloaded it, and then whatever it took, if it took 2 or 3 of them to portage one of these, or 4 or 6 of them to portage one of them, it got lifted up and carried up. It never touched it. What was that series they had with Centennial? The guy comes up to the shore, Richard Chamberlain or one of them, Robert, whatever the other guy's name was. The James Mitchell, many that canoe, birch bark canoe, just rammed her up on shore, he came and dragged it up. He'd have tore that thing apart. That was a real canoe.
Merv, did the missionaries out here have anything to do with the fur trade? Did they attach onto the fur groups as opposed?
Yeah, Grace Lee Newt wrote a book called Documents Relating to Northwest Missions, and it started around Grand Portage. So think about more about their contribution to our state. What's the first town in Minnesota that's still a town? Grand Portage. No, not here. Nobody was down here. You know, no, it was Grand Portage. It's the longest lasting town in our whole state. In Canada, you take like Calgary, Edmonton, they wouldn't have been, nothing would have happened there until the railroad. That would have been almost 100 years later, like the later 1800s. Canadian National, Canadian Pacific. These guys did it all. Great. Their families. Omir's got he's got a number of books. His fur trade aspect ones are written. There's one about women of the fur trade. I forget. That's good too. I mean, they were great contributors to it. So, but these guys are basically the mules. They transported all that stuff. And they were left behind. And he talks O'Meara talks on Lake Winnipeg. They used to race across Lake Winnipeg. I don't know why the guys don't want to race, because as soon as you get off the water, but anyway, he talks about one of these guys falling out of the canoe, and then the very last canoe, he picked him up, otherwise he'd have been eaten down. You ever heard of Eric Severin? He was in Minnesota. And when he graduated from the University of Minnesota, he and Walter Port canoed up to Minnesota. Okay, all the way up to Minnesota, Mankato out here. The worst times, some of their worst times are in here. It's really shallow, that agricultural land, all mud and stuff, where the Minnesota starts, where the Red River starts. Went all the way, and they when they got to Lake Winnipeg, they took a boat across that, or you'd have never heard of Eric Severin. Okay, and when you got there, it was good. These guys, him and Walter, they were fighting each other at different times when they got here. Because here's the main river to Nelson River, to the Hudson Bay. That's where they had to get by winter. They'd be froze out somewhere. Yeah. Native Americans, the Crees. No, you can't go that way. It's the bigger river. They said it's not navigable. You got to go over to the Hayes River to get there. Native Americans told me the same. So they finally went down the Hayes River, which ties in, and that got them. So then they had the winter at Hudson Bay, and then I forget how they went home. But that book is called Canoeing with the Cree, and that's still kept. And you can all, Emily made some copies of different books that are still in print, some that you can still find. And what are them organizations that make books on demand? A lot of these books that are in that book list, they're mentioned, you can order them that way. They're not the nice old books like these here.
They're sitting on the chair by the door back there if you want.
Yeah, grab one of them.
Any
Any
other
more
questions?
What did the Jays Treaty have to do with all the fur trading in Canada coming down with Minnesota?
The which?
The Jays Treaty of
Oh.
1796.
Yes, that was one of the first treaties. Because you think about it, about 5 years later, then the Northwest Company decides it had to do with the boundary. And it was finally coming in the beat. Weren't many Americans that ever got out this far yet. When did Fort Snelling start? 1819 maybe? And they were out here a little bit before that. But it was Grand Portage, 1730s. Grand Portage. It's been a settlement since then. You know, the revolution had been fought then.
We're not sure about the accuracy of the fact of this, but a canoe was found at the bottom of Lake Sylvia by Annandale, weighted down.
Yep.
And apparently that's where they store the canoe in the wintertime, so it wouldn't get stolen.
Oh, geez. What was it made out of?
The birch.
Really? That would last? Yeah, no, I never heard that.
It
But of
was
course,
weighted down with rocks.
yeah.
And then it would be in a safe place over winter.
Wow. But you know, getting back to sinking stuff like that pemmican in those 90-pound bags, that stuff was buried along the route, so they'd have some coming back. You know, it could only be purchased out on the plains. You know, just the pemmican from the tribes there, mostly the Sioux. Oh, tons of them, yes. But the beaver was what drove that industry. Minks, a mink might have gotten more money, but it wasn't the abundance of them. And anywhere they went, then 20 years later, they're starting to make beaver extinct in these areas. So like I say, they kept pushing, they had to push west. And the colder the climate is, the farther north you got, the better the felt was. You can understand that just by. Which ones?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
When did they stop, at the season? Not when they stopped, what year, but was this something that they could only do up until October or?
October was too late for a lot of these places up north. They had to really race. It happened during July, so they got August, maybe August and September, maybe 2 months to paddle. And they made more time than anybody else. And they shot rapids and stuff, you know, she kind of dramatizes here, but they're shooting rapids there. And they found, it's a book that the Historical Society published called Voices from the Rapids. And it's fascinating, all the different things that were preserved, files. And all kinds.
How many canoe trips have you been on total?
Over 50.
I don't know if this is historically
Yeah.
accurate, but
Let's
I
hear it.
always understood as a teacher that the lead paddler was the best singer. And then rhythmically,
Yeah.
they would paddle together.
They did like a cadence.
Yes.
And the song would be to a speed that they could paddle.
Yes.
Yes, yes. No, I've heard of that too. Very good. We saw it. We saw a replica of a birch bark. It wasn't made out of birch bark. I don't know what it was made out of. Thick varnish and stuff. But they had speakers and batteries. Can't imagine portaging that stuff. Just so they could just.
Just a little sidelight, those guys that go up like Great Slave Lake and stuff.
Yeah.
They can only go up there in June and July.
Okay.
That's the only season they get, but in July, the mosquitoes are so bad, you can't see in front of you.
Yeah.
So can you imagine being in that?
Yeah.
For a month? You die just from being bitten by mosquitoes.
Some of these journals, they're only sentenced maybe for a week. Mosquitoes are bad, black flies are bad, no-see-ums are bad. Yeah, crazy.
What was the life expectancy?
I think about 30, 40. I mean, most they had hernias and stuff. It wasn't a good life. And the money they made, they usually spent outside the fort at Grand Portage. Yeah, yeah. But you know, they were left over from the French era.
Career doing what they were doing, kind of much more than 10, 12 years.
That wasn't a good career. When you're getting used like an animal, it's not a good career. The only guys that had it made, and they didn't even have it made, were the guys that sat and met it. Next to Mrs. Hopkins.
Well, thank you, Herb, for coming.
You're welcome.